Again, thank you for joining us for considering discontinuation of IEP services from a speech-language pathologist. I am pleased to have Lisa Kirby-Mangus with us today, and I'll let her introduce herself to you.
Hello, welcome. I am Lisa Kirby-Mangus. I am a program support teacher in speech and language in the Madison Metropolitan School District, and I'm excited to discuss this topic with you today.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa was one of the committee members who helped develop the guidance for this, and so it's great to have her here to talk about the perspective of someone who is still working in the schools and maybe give you some good examples of practical application of some of the material that we'll present today. There is a slide handout available for you, and there's a QR code here for that if you would like to grab that quick. And it will be available online later too if you miss it. But if you want to follow along directly in the slides, you can grab it here. So overall, we really hope to increase your confidence during IEP meetings to be able to answer inquiries and actions regarding discontinuation of services. And our goal as SLPs is to really become knowledgeable enough to help guide the discussion and answer questions and offer rationales for discontinuation of services. So we're going to look at defining discontinuation, how to guide teams in asking specific questions and really scaffolding the discontinuation discussions, and how to employ some best practices surrounding discontinuation of services. And our agenda today really involves diving deep into each section of the discontinuation guidance document. And while content of this guidance document is specific to the area of speech and language, much of the information can be applied universally. But keep in mind that there may be laws or regulations in state statute that impact other areas of practice differently from speech and language. So caution while you're interpreting the guidance for other areas. And to access the guidance document directly, DPI Speech or Language Impairment webpage is your place to start. And I'll switch to that screen. So hopefully you can see that now. The Speech or Language Impairment webpage is where you would go, and you would click on Hot Topics in IEP Development, Service Delivery, and Equity Resources. And in this Hot Topics area is where you will find all kinds of updated guidance, but our document that we're talking about today, considering discontinuation of services, is right there. It's the second one listed. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of where to find that if you want to look at the document directly as we're going through today's session. So we want to start by defining discontinuation, and discontinuation is also commonly referred to as dismissal of special education services, so specially designed instruction or related services provided by a speech-language pathologist. It might be applicable to students identified with a speech or language impairment, or SLI, or any other disability category. Discontinuation means removing a service from the student's IEP because that service is no longer needed by the student. So one thing that we want you to keep in mind is, are we presuming competence, that students are capable from the beginning and really focusing on their potential rather than their limitations, kind of that social model of disability versus the medical model. And we're going to discuss this more later in the presentation, but want to have that at the top of your mind right now. According to ASHA, the dismissal goals of speech-language services should be made clear to parents and teachers. And ASHA highlights that this can be done during the student's initial IEP and continuing annually from there. So teams should really specify the individual goals that will lead to dismissal services. So really the first step in the dismissal process should occur when a student is first determined to be eligible for special education services. And the Wisconsin DPI offers the following compliance guidelines to IEP teams that are considering discontinuation of IEP services from a speech-language pathologist. So if identified as a child with SLI, along with another disability category, or receiving specially designed instruction from an SLP, speech and language services can be discontinued at an IEP meeting without initiating a reevaluation of the child. if the child will continue to receive other special education services. So a child has to receive specially designed instruction in at least one area in order to have an IEP. And then the IEP team must reevaluate the child in the area of speech and language at the next reevaluation time when SLI is either the reporting or the other, or commonly referred to as secondary disability category. If a child with a disability in another area other than SLI is receiving speech and language as a related services, the IEP team can discontinue speech and language services without conducting a reevaluation. So that would be similar to what our partners in physical therapy or occupational therapy can do, where they would discharge or dismiss or discontinue a related service at an IEP meeting. And then we want to have you remind you of the section on the SLI criteria form, where we look at initial evaluation and reevaluation and determining disability category criteria. So for students who were previously found eligible for special education and meeting the SLI criteria, this section is really where you look to decide and determine yes or no whether the student's disability no longer adversely impacts their educational performance, whether there is an adverse impact on their educational performance. And, really looking at all of that data that's already existing, and then whatever else was determined that we needed to gather. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. So when IEP teams develop and discuss a long-term vision for a student's communication development at the beginning when students are first eligible, it provides a sense of purpose and direction to the team and the services being provided. Discussion of this long-term vision and discussion of expected outcomes should start when the team first finds a student eligible for special education. And then the discussion should be continued during all IEP discussions. This slide includes some considerations that IEP team participants can look at to create a long-term vision of communication skills for students. The first one is discontinuation is a positive outcome. It is discontinuation of the provision of IEP services by an SLP is a positive outcome that reflects the success of the student's teachers, education, and the IEP process. The goal of speech and language services in the public schools is to address and improve a student's communication so that it supports academic achievement and functional performance. Are we presuming competence? That is that students are capable from the beginning, focusing on their potentials rather than their limitations. We can do this by focusing on basic skill remediation and learning strategies that we'll talk about in a few slides. Secondly, the student outcome for performance shall focus on bringing skills with accommodations and supports provided as necessary to within an expected range for the student's age and grade when compared with the Wisconsin academic standards and Wisconsin social and emotional learning competencies. Then third, teams should reject the idea of perfection. This is a main idea in our presentation today. Teams should recognize that the pursuit of perfection is not a realistic goal. Instead, they can ask, is the student able to function adequately in their educational setting? And then lastly, number 4, maximize inclusion. So teams should apply the least restrictive environment requirements with a focus on maximizing inclusion from the start of services. Fostering an inclusive educational environment should be the primary objective when it comes to students with disabilities. It is crucial to prioritize integration within regular education classrooms alongside peers without disabilities. However, there may be some circumstances where the unique needs of a student require removal from the classrooms. This next slide also has a lot of information. According to the American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA, the first step in the dismissal or discontinuation process should occur when the student is first determined to be eligible. So again, right from the eligibility meeting, talking about what the long-term communication goals are for a student. In making sure that the services from a speech language pathologist are aligned with the student's disability-related needs and goals. This discussion, this long-term vision and discussion can start again at the eligibility meeting. Initial IEP meetings could and should include a discussion to ensure that all IEP participants have shared an understanding of the expected outcomes of the student's special education and related services. And in doing so, the team should take into consideration state and local standards and expectations, the student's prior and current educational performance, the student's age, culture, language background, and dialect, as well as the student's social, emotional, or vocational development. Annual IEP review meetings should include a discussion of current goals, objectives, and IEP goal progress in comparison to the ultimate communication goal, so that long-term goal that was discussed at eligibility. In this way, families are a part of a consistent discussion regarding current progress in comparison to that expected end goal of services. IEP team discussions may also include a consideration of various service delivery options. So the setting, the dosage, the format, and the provider, and thinking about the least restrictive environment based on the student's needs so that the team is ensuring a free and appropriate public education. When the student has achieved the desired outcomes, so number 3, of performing at the expected level, thus no longer requiring special education support from a speech language pathologist, IEP teams should discuss discontinuation of speech and language services. And I just wanted to provide an example. Sometimes examples help us take the knowledge away from webinars. So this example is about Janaya. Janaya was 3 years old when it was first determined by an IEP team that she was eligible for special education services, specifically speech and language services, based on significant scores from norm referenced assessments and an analysis of a collected language sample. Janaya's IEP goals for all of this time have focused on producing complete grammatically accurate sentences, using descriptive language, incorporating narrative story structures and retells, and using word finding strategies. Now Janaya is in 8th grade, and she has a triennial annual 3-year evaluation. And during assessment, she achieved scores in the average range on a comprehensive language assessment. And these scores were compared with the previous 2 reevaluations over the last 6 years. And this comparison showed consistent growth in her achievement in core language skills and index scores on that norm referenced assessment, and culminating now in average performance. Janaya's oral language content and form were further assessed through dynamic assessment methods, including the SLAM cards and the transcribed narrative language sample. And during those 2 samples, language samples, Janaya demonstrated solid language skills, produced utterances of 11 or more words, used conjunctions to form complex sentences, and included essential information needed for stories to be retold and coherent to a listener. During her narrative, she effectively marked characters with names, described their actions and emotions, and the detailed events of the story, and addressed some problems. Also, a criterion referenced rating scale for self-reflection was used, and Janaya expressed herself that she was confident in her communication skills. She reported that she did well with storytelling and she enjoyed that. She liked learning in the classroom, and she felt she had strategies for learning new vocabulary and concepts, and that she used word finding strategies on her own, and she was able to describe her favorite strategies, such as description and scanning the alphabet. And the teacher feedback and rating scales confirmed that Janaya is successfully participating in the academic curriculum. Teachers noted Janaya's willingness to engage in classwork, seek and ask for help when necessary. And they noticed that she used some of these word finding strategies when they could tell that she was having a delay in thinking of the word she wanted to use. And they also even noted that she will stay after school and ask questions or ask for extra help. The teachers weren't sure if they should be concerned that there are still instances of word finding occurring. When the team looked at all the assessment information, and then looked at the Wisconsin language rubric that is on the speech and language page that Dawn showed you before, Janaya's language skills on that rubric were within normal limits with minimal impact on her academic and social functioning. So even though there were instances of word finding happening in all environments, including her educational environment, she had made significant progress, met her goals, and is an effective communicator. And so the team determined that she no longer met the eligibility for a speech and language disability. And they also determined she did not need the direct services from a speech language pathologist, so they discontinued services. This slide shows those two ways of working on skills: the basic skills remediation strategy and then learning strategies approach. And they align with best practices in speech and language and tie with discontinuation practices as outlined by ASHA. If an IEP team concludes that the student's communication needs are remediated, or that the student is using those compensatory strategies, the discussion regarding discontinuation is warranted. It's a good topic for a team to talk about. The purpose of the basic skills approach is to provide remediation by alleviating disability-related needs and basic skills. Therefore, it focuses on that basic skill acquisition, which could lessen the effects of the student's abilities or disability on accessing, engaging, and making progress in age and grade level curriculum, instruction, environments, or activities, versus the learning strategies approach, which helps equip the student with procedures to facilitate their learning, including compensatory tools. It includes metacognitive approaches where the student must think about their own thinking and practice their own problem solving. And it includes students' independent use of supports and accommodations so that the student no longer requires that specially designed instruction, direct service, or a related service. Presenting these approaches can provide the speech language pathologist a platform to facilitate a conversation surrounding discontinuation. This next slide is just another demonstration of those two approaches, the basic skills approach and the learning strategies approach. And the reason we included this slide again is teams can ask, how early in the life of the IEP are we asking students what their goals are, what they're working on, talking about self-monitoring, helping them practice self-monitoring and self-correcting and changing productions, adding parts to stories. It should begin in the beginning, and even very young children, in my experience, can tell you, especially if you talk about it every time you're working together, what they're working on, what their goal is, and that helps focus their work and know why you're working with them. SLPs in the end should not be the only conduit or cue for students to use these new skills. So we think about gradual release. And if the student does not need specialized instruction, likely they do not need speech and language services to make progress on other IEP goals or to make progress educationally. So now let's see how this basic skill and learning strategies approach align with DPI's guidance around discontinuation and further prepare us to hold discussions about discontinuation. So this is just a quick reminder from ASHA about discontinuation. A team concludes that the communication disorder is remediated or when compensatory strategies are successfully established. So this ties into the last few slides with the basic skills approach and basic skills remediation and the learning strategies. We support the development of skills through direct teaching while also supporting development of a growth mindset so that we can move towards that gradual release along the way, teaching students to self-monitor and to self-correct. And when the disorder is remediated or those compensatory strategies are used independently, that is the time that we can think about discontinuation. Okay, I'll pass back to Dawn.
Thank you, Lisa. So according to ASHA and their ad hoc committee on admission, discharge criteria, and speech language pathology, there are several signs that a student might be ready to discontinue services from a speech language pathologist. A student does not need to meet all of these guidelines to be considered for discontinuation. And these are only examples. There may be other reasons not outlined here that provide a rationale for discontinuation. Any one of these guidelines could initiate an IEP team discussion about discontinuing services. So the first one that we see in the box here, that communication skills are within age or grade level standards and expectations, considering the student's age and cultural background. So discontinuation decisions should not be based on a student's IQ scores being commensurate with language scores. That practice of comparing IQ scores and language scores is often referred to as cognitive referencing, and it's not supported by ASHA or DPI, as research suggests that language skills may surpass cognitive skills. The next box looks at IEP goals have been met. So that's a really good one to take a look at. Have they been met? You know, are there other ones that the student needs, or is the student in fact ready for discontinuation? The third one is the student and family are satisfied with the student's current communication. And the fourth one, the student's communication differences no longer adversely affect them academically, socially, or functionally. So think back to that initial thought of we're not going for perfection necessarily, but is there no longer an adverse effect? So this includes instances where the student has developed alternative modes of communication, maybe using an AAC device, and also includes instances where the student has developed sufficient compensatory skills or strategies. So it could be differences and not an adverse effect. And so all of those could be readiness indicators for discontinuation. In circumstances when a student is not making sufficient progress towards meeting their age or grade level standards and expectations, that in and of itself should not be a reason to look at discontinuation. It's a reason to investigate more. So the IEP team should meet to explore why progress is insufficient and decide if and how the IEP should be revised to address continuing or different disability-related needs. Revisions might include changes such as new goals, additional or different types of services, changes in location, or other aspects of service delivery. For example, the IEP team may determine students' needs and communication can be best met by other services other than a speech language pathologist. So just something to consider as you are looking at discontinuation. And it's not always easy to determine when to discontinue services when a student is still not demonstrating skills that are similar to their non-disabled peers. So we've also looked at some guiding questions for you that may be helpful when you're considering discontinuation of IEP services from a speech language pathologist. It may be beneficial for the team to really review the purpose of the IEP services from a speech language pathologist. The overarching goal is to address and improve the student's communication to support their academic achievement and their functional performance. So this includes a student communicating successfully with accommodations and supports provided as necessary. After you review the purpose of services from the SLP and those indicators of readiness for discontinuation, then you can review some of these guiding questions that we're going to talk about next. This is a simplified version of the guiding questions for IEP team discussion for those of you who prefer a visual representation, but we're going to talk about each of the question areas coming up. You would start here, and is the student meeting those age or grade level standards? You remember that from the previous chart. Have they met their IEP goals? Can their disability-related needs in the area of communication be met in other ways? Is there no longer an educational need for services from an SLP? Is the student making sufficient progress towards their goals? And this chart will kind of help guide you to determine we need to continue services. We might want to look at modifying goals, service delivery, the frequency, the amount, or modifications and supports for school personnel. Or we may consider, do we need to continue services or consider discontinuation of services? And then keeping in mind that if SLI is one of those disability categories, that we need to be a member of the next reevaluation for that student. So SLI cannot be added or removed from a student as a disability category without the presence of a speech language pathologist, and that is on that criteria form and also in state statute. So again, looking at the purpose of services, the discussion can lead to a discussion in discontinuation. So looking at, are the students' communication skills or strategies comparable to those of others without disabilities or of the same chronological age, gender, ethnicity, or cultural or linguistic background? Is the student a functional and effective communicator? How are they using their skills? Are there some neurodivergent consideration? And is there support for generalization? Has the student met their IEP goals? Are there other needs and goals that require services from an SLP? Are the services related to a functional and meaningful goal? What are the thoughts and emotions of the student and their family regarding the current level of communication skills and strategies? What may be the impact of continuing or discontinuing services? What social goals does the student have or the family? What values might the family hold about how the student should interact? Is there an adverse effect on the student's educational performance, including academic and functional skill performance, that's rooted in their communication skills? What specific communication need is adversely impacting their access or progress towards IEP goals or their educational environment and curriculum? And as a result, do they require services from an SLP to have a reasonable opportunity to benefit from special education? Do we have the mindset of presuming competence and assessing whether there is really an adverse educational impact while really considering the student's confidence and viewpoint of their own communication skills? And are these communication services that the child needs services that only an SLP can provide due to their professional expertise and unique skill set? Is it essential for the student to have direct speech and language services provided by a licensed SLP? Are we really working at the top of our license in order for the student to make progress toward achieving goals? If the student with a disability has communication needs, those do not always need to be addressed by an SLP. So many needs can be addressed in other ways. So this could include the student's regular education teacher, other special education providers. Think about the areas of social skills or social communication that typically comes to mind when we're talking about others that may help provide some services to that student to address their needs. Can the student effectively access and participate in the educational environment without the need of ongoing services from a speech language pathologist? Is there an overlap or duplication of services? Does the student's general and special education programming provide for necessary instruction in language and communication skills? And has service delivery been modified over time? So a student should not be in the same mode of service delivery from the time of initial evaluation to discontinuation of services. Really look at the location, the setting, the dosage, the frequency, the format of services, type of session, individual, group, consult. Is it provided in the classroom? Is it pull-out? And the provider that is needed. So the SLP, the teacher, and other support personnel. I think Lisa has another example for us, and then we'll move into our next section.
Thank you, Dawn. I do. And sometimes as you're working in a school building and you're thinking about discontinuation for a student from speech and language services, you may get different information or thoughts from other staff that work with you and work with the student. So this is an example of that. Isaac, who had been receiving speech sound production services since kindergarten, who's now in 5th grade. His speech is now described as intelligible, but he has noticeable residual R distortions and derotization. And during structured activities with the speech pathologist, Isaac accurately produces R and vocalic R in sentences with 95% accuracy. A review of the therapy data at this reeval and of the progress reports indicated that Isaac had not really made much progress past that accuracy at sentence level. He had not really moved on to generalizing the speech sound production to multiple environments and without cues being provided. His classroom teacher noted that although she found his R distortion distracting and noticeable in the classroom, it was not impeding his participation or communication in the classroom. In fact, he was very verbal, and he was consistently performing as one of the top students academically in the class, and he would take leadership roles in small group activities. The teacher really thought, though, that his speech would prevent him from progressing later in life and felt that the speech language pathologist would be the only one with the skills to provide support. During the assessment, the SLP interviewed Isaac, and he expressed that he was very comfortable with his current speech production, and he didn't want to go to speech therapy anymore. He wanted to be with his class. He felt that going to get speech services or having the speech pathologist work with him in the classroom made him look different than his peers. And Isaac's parents were supportive of that. They expressed satisfaction with his speech, even though they continued to notice the R distortions. And they noted that Isaac successfully was participating in community plays and drama productions, which further demonstrated his confidence and their confidence in his communication. So in the end, when the team looked at all of the information and considered the classroom teacher's concerns, they determined that Isaac's residual R distortions no longer affected Isaac educationally. His success in education was consistent with or above his peers. His family was satisfied with his progress and his current speech production. And when necessary, Isaac could modify his productions even with reminders from the classroom teachers. That was not something that specifically a speech language pathologist needed to be present in the classroom. The teachers would also ask questions or give cues, and Isaac was able to modify his production to accurate art productions. So based on those facts, the team determined that Isaac was no longer found eligible for speech and language services, and that direct instruction by a speech language pathologist was no longer necessary for Isaac to be successful at school.
You can see here that while there are specialized skill sets of an SLP, we're not the only one with training and experience in a number of areas such as language, social skills, sometimes feeding and swallowing in schools, AAC, or literacy. But there are areas where, this is really our specialty, and we may be the only person with the unique skill set to provide those services to a student. And if there are multiple ways to meet the child's needs, those factors should be taken into consideration. So can the student's disability-related needs in the area of language or communication be met through classroom accommodations or by other special education providers? We always want to look at the area of supplementary aids and services first and how we can keep that student within the general education classroom. Is there evidence to suggest that the student will continue to develop communication skills without intervention or with support from other special education services or special education providers? Is there likelihood that the student will not make reasonable progress or could regress if the student does not receive services from an SLP? Those are some other things that you can keep in the back of your mind or discuss with your teams. And so we talked a little bit earlier about no longer making progress. Consider DPI guidance from the speech or language impairment criteria, guidance documents that when the student is not making progress towards IEP goals, the IEP team should reconvene to discuss why the student is not making progress. IEP teams should review the disability-related needs, the current goals, the services, including that frequency, duration, amount, and location of services. The IEP team may also identify additional instructional strategies that can be used to support the student to access and engage in the educational environment and to show progress on their goals. Following that review, the IEP team may revise the IEP as appropriate. Other considerations is were cultural and linguistic needs and concerns considered and addressed appropriately when that student is no longer making progress? Were relevant and accurate criteria used to evaluate the effectiveness of the instruction or other interventions, and was input and collaboration with other professionals considered? When students demonstrate through their behavior either low motivation or engagement to participate in services from a speech language pathologist, or when asked about how they feel about the speech and language services, they state that they do not like participating. We borrowed some language from the Department of Education at Virginia that suggests that IEP teams should consider addressing the root cause of the disinterest or lack of motivation, and possible outcomes of that root cause analysis might include a student's disability-related need may be supported by other team members, a joint effort to support motivation, maybe working with a school counselor, school psychologist, school social worker to determine why the student is not motivated and what can be done, maybe a change in intervention, goals, or a service delivery model to make the services more meaningful, culturally relevant, or engaging for the student. And then additional considerations should be given to the student's autonomy and preferences for communication. Some students may feel that they do not want to be fixed and that their communication is functional. In situations like this, the IEP team should reconvene and discuss student and family concerns and considerations, and the meeting must be held prior to making any changes in placement. A parent may withdraw consent for special education and related services at any time, but the withdrawal must be for all special education related services. In other words, a parent cannot revoke or consent to some services, but keep others. All right, Lisa, I'm inviting you back in again, and then we'll finish up with our last section on supplementary aids and services.
Yes, thank you, Dawn. I have one example related to the root cause of discontinuation and services being culturally relevant for our English language learners. From And we're thinking, of course, when we do evaluations for English language learners, there are many considerations that we need to consider, and consider the transfer of skills, if there's transfer of skills, what the characteristics are of their home or first language. And so reviewing our therapy data and student progress and generalization of skills is especially important as these students gain more English skills as they progress in school. So Oscar is a native Spanish speaking bilingual student, and he has been receiving speech and language services since 4K to support his oral language development. And his IEP goals focused on improving the use of prepositions, increasing the length of his utterances. Now he's in 6th grade, and he has an access score of 6. And his teacher reports that he's making academic progress comparable to his peers and is frequently volunteering to speak in class. And so the teacher described Oscar's communication as being effective in the school setting, even though she was noticing some grammatical and semantic errors in his utterances. The biggest concern, this was not a triannual, this was a reevaluation that was initiated by the team. Oscar was refusing to work with the SLP, was hiding when the SLP entered the classroom, would not leave with the SLP to work with the SLP in another environment. So the team was considering what is the root cause, what are his skills, what is going on here. So the current SLP conducted a comprehensive assessment incorporating some classroom observations, teacher and parent interviews, dynamic assessment, and language sample analysis. And the English language sample revealed some errors. His access score is 6 now. But the focus instead, when the SLP was analyzing the sample, was placed on the type of errors rather than the frequency of the errors. And upon analysis, the errors were primarily related to verb tense in English, word order, and the use or omission of prepositions. So for instance, Oscar inconsistently applied verb tense rules during the sample. Some of his utterances followed accurate English language patterns, but others reflected the transfer of the Spanish language influence patterns. So for example, he added ED to some irregular verbs, such as he said he sitted instead of he sat. And this is an influence of his first language and home language, Spanish, rather than a language disorder. This is what the IEP team talked about. And the difference was not affecting the success, the team said, of Oscar's message being understood. Sometimes Spanish prepositions are embedded within verbs. And even though Oscar has increased his use of English at school, sometimes in his utterances, he was omitting some of the prepositions, because in Spanish, they are often embedded within the verbs. So for example, he said, he look his book instead of he looked for his book. And in addition, the word order errors that were noticed, Spanish has more flexibility in spoken word order than English. So these variations the team determined were more common and transfers from Spanish, his home language, that he still used frequently. And it was not affecting the message of his communication. He, in an interview, noted that he would prefer to stay in the classroom with his peers. He didn't want help from extra adults who weren't, as he put it, supposed to be in the classroom. He didn't want that extra support. The team noted that the IEP goals that he'd been working on, they had tried to ensure that they weren't focused on perfect English language production for this bilingual student, and instead tried to focus on successful communication and lack of adverse effects in the student's educational performance. So for Oscar, he was a successful communicator, and he was successful academically in his education. Sorry, I lost my place there. And then during the dynamic assessment, Oscar demonstrated high responsiveness and easily transferred language structures with minimal support from the SLP. So this showed his high modifiability, suggesting internal language abilities in the capacity to adjust his productions independently. So the team discussed all of this information and the fact that Oscar really was not motivated to work with the speech pathologist, work on anything that his classmates weren't working on. And they determined that Oscar did not have an oral language disability. The root cause of his disinterest, the team determined, was that he was experiencing successful communication, and he did not prefer to work on anything because he was happy and successful with his communication and was achieving at school. And his expressive language did not negatively impact his educational performance. So the team determined that he did not meet eligibility criteria for speech and language services. Okay, so this next slide, the following that we will go through in the next slides, IEP accommodations and supports are related to disability-related needs in the areas of communication, and may provide teams with strategies and options when considering discontinuation of services from a speech language pathologist. The considerations below in these next slides may be documented in the IEP and supported, as Dawn mentioned in a previous slide, by other educators beyond a speech language pathologist, including accommodations documented as supplementary aids and services, which also may be supported through the general education teacher or a paraprofessional in the regular education environment. These accommodations may be taught through scaffolding of services, starting from the initial evaluation. And in addition, the following strategies the SLP may train or provide consultation to other educators on how to implement and document in the program modifications and support part of the IEP. So we're talking about Section 9, referring to Section 9 of the speech and language eligibility criteria. So many of these strategies suggested in this last section are strategies that are beneficial for all students and are part of differentiated regular education instruction. So consider these could be possible accommodations or strategies to support academic and functional performance in speech production, such as modeling accurate, correct, and typical speech production in the classroom, allowing longer response time, discussing with a student if they want reminders or prompts for their speech sound production in the classroom, reinforcing the new way of producing speech sounds to encourage and increase the likelihood of use and generalization of those new speech sounds, providing practice time for oral presentations, not penalizing students for speech sound errors during presentations or in class, and considering if substitutions for oral assignments or presentations is needed to allow the student to demonstrate what they are learning without being concerned about the actual sound production. Some language accommodations or strategies that teams might consider are providing a written copy of the lesson outline or notes, pre-teaching vocabulary and concepts before presenting the topic or before the instruction begins, providing word banks for class topics, allowing longer oral response time, providing graphic organizers, providing visuals to support learning, classroom tasks, expectations, and directions, and allowing verbal responses to questions to be explained to a partner before being shared with the class for formulation practice. Allowing options for oral presentations or assignments, providing access to a variety of pre-planning or other organizational tools, providing students with time to rehearse oral content prior to presentation, permitting students to record an oral presentation so that they don't have to present in front of a live audience, and considering options for non-speaking roles in group assignments or small group activities. Some accommodations or strategies that can be considered by teams to support academic and functional performance in social communication could be educating staff and peers about neurodivergent communication, encouraging the student to join a club or organization that includes one of their special interests and meet like-minded students. And if a grading rubric includes points for group work, eliminating that factor for the student if their communication creates barriers to their engagement in such activities for class. In the area of AAC, some strategies that could be considered include have different devices been tried? Is the team waiting for certain skills to be developed before they allow the student to attempt using AAC across learning environments? Is there a robust vocabulary? Is there a need for skills backed by research or practice? As we're remembering, there are no prerequisite skills for using AAC. And does the student have access to a robust vocabulary? Are there accommodations or strategies to support academic and functional performance in communication using the AAC? It might include some of the things that I'm sure all of you have suggested to teams, such as allowing for wait time, instructing other paraprofessionals or teachers on the content and how to model use of the AAC device, and also strategically asking questions that can be answered with the words on their device. It's also known as descriptive teaching now. There's information out about that. And definitely classroom routines that follow a predictable format support AAC users. Some possible fluency strategies or accommodations might be having one-on-one conversations with the student to determine if they want reminders or prompts about using strategies. Talking with other team members about using a reduced rate and modeling pausing, other adults conveying that they're listening to the content of the message, not how it's said, to be supportive and accepting of all stuttering events, to do anything to reduce pressure to communicate in the classroom, this is a strategy that I'm sure you've provided, avoid telling the student to slow down. Do not allow others to interrupt or discuss how interruptions break down communication. Allow longer oral response time. Allow for oral presentations or assignments to be recorded or presented in other ways. Do not penalize, of course, for disfluencies, and consider options for non-speaking roles in group assignments. And then the last area is voice considerations, accommodations, and strategies that teams could consider. It might be implementing vocal hygiene strategies, such as this is a little bit controversial now in our field, but access to a water bottle, hydration, though, it's good for our brains, to also to use fluency strategies, and modifying assignments that require oral presentations so that the student can share what they have learned in other ways besides using their voice.
Thank you, Lisa. So all of those accommodations specific to each of the areas can be found in the discontinuation document. So you can go there to get those examples. And just a reminder that examples that we've provided today are student specific and not meant to be guidance from DPI, especially like the examples Lisa provided in each of those situations, but really just ways for you to think about how that situation may apply to your students. And keep in mind that decisions related to discontinuation are always an IEP team decision. And I want to thank you again for joining us today. I want to thank the following individuals for assisting with guidance and helping develop this document: Alyssa Wittina, Christine Carey, Lisa Kirby-Mangus, and Courtney Seidel. And again, there's a certificate of attendance available for you. It's also in the slide handout if you can't grab it from here right now. And just to let you know, there's a lot of references and resources that this group used to help prepare this presentation. So those are available for you as well.